She traced her stallion to the grave of a legendary gunslinger, only to find him breathing at dawn. The sun-scorched caldera of the Badlands was a place that bled despair. It was a realm of baked earth and skeletal rock exuding a silence thick with grief, desperation, and the kind of stubborn resolve that now settled deep in Cyrilda's own bones. She knelt her calloused fingers tracing the sharp edge of a hoof print in the clay. Ghost. The stallion was more than just the last vestige of her father's failing ranch. He was a promise she'd made to a ghost. Losing him wasn't an option. She had true grit, and giving up was a luxury she couldn't afford. But the trail was turning strange. It didn't lead toward water or pasture. It climbed aiming for a jagged bone-white ridge known for bad medicine and worse ends. The horse wasn't just lost. He was on a pilgrimage. A cold dread coiled in her gut. What if the stallion she was hunting wasn't leading her back to her future, but to someone else's buried past? The sun was a merciless hammer in a brass sky, beating the land into a state of stunned submission. It was a place that bled despair, a realm of baked earth and skeletal rock that exuded a silence thick with grief. For 3 days that silence had been Cyrilda's only companion. She knelt her body a tight coil of weariness and will. Her calloused fingers, gentle as a lover's touch, traced the sharp crescent of a hoof print in the clay. It was fresh, no more than a few hours old. Ghost. The name was a whisper in her mind, a prayer against the vast, unforgiving landscape. The stallion was more than just the last vestige of her father's failing ranch, the only asset the bankers hadn't yet sunk their teeth into. He was a promise she'd made to a ghost of her own, a vow whispered at a fresh graveside a month prior. "He's got the spirit of the wind in him," Siri, her father's voice, echoed in her memory, rough and warm like worn leather. "Can't be broken, only understood." She rose, her gaze sweeping the horizon. Understanding the horse meant understanding this land. She saw it not as a map, but as a story. A rustle of leaves in a dry arroyo told of his passing. A single dark horsehair snagged on a thorny branch confirmed his path. She was a survivor honed by her father's hard lessons. This was her world, and she would not let it crumble to dust. "Stubborn old man," she murmured to the wind, her voice a dry rasp. "Just as stubborn as the horse you loved more than me sometimes." A hollow ache pulsed in her chest, sharp and familiar. She pushed it down. Grief was a luxury, a heavy coat she couldn't afford to wear under this relentless sun. She had only room for the weight of her water canteen and the heavier burden of her resolve. By midday, the trail began to turn strange. Any sensible creature, man or beast, would be seeking the shade of the cottonwoods that marked a distant, meandering creek. But Ghost's tracks climbed. They moved away from the promise of life, aiming for the high, desolate places. A jagged, bone-white ridge loomed ahead, a spine of rock known to the old-timers as the Devil's Jaw. Nothing grew there. Nothing lived there. He wasn't just lost. He was on a pilgrimage. "What are you doing, boy?" She whispered, her hand instinctively going to the worn wooden handle of the knife on her hip. A new feeling began to prickle beneath her skin, colder than the desert wind. Not fear. Something sharper. A profound sense of wrongness. This wasn't the trail of a panicked animal. It was the trail of a creature with a purpose. An hour later she found it. A glint of metal against red rock. She eased forward her steps, silent, and picked it up. It was a buckle, ornate and silver, attached to a torn piece of thick leather strapping. It wasn't from her tack. It wasn't from any saddle she had ever seen on her father's ranch. The leather was still supple, the tear fresh. He hadn't been alone. The thought sent a shiver through her, a stark violation of her lonely vigil. Was he being pursued, or was he following someone? The sun beat down, but the world felt suddenly cold. The silence was no longer empty. It was watchful, waiting. She pressed on the silver buckle clutched in her fist, its unfamiliar weight a sinister omen. The air grew thinner as she climbed the final approach to the ridge. The wind whistled through the rocks a mournful, hollow song. It sounded like a lament. Peering over the final crest of rock, she finally saw him. Ghost. He stood 100 yards below in a small sheltered basin, his magnificent gray coat shimmering in the harsh light. He was unharmed. But he wasn't grazing. He wasn't resting. He stood utterly still, his head bowed like a soldier at attention. A sentinel. He was keeping vigil. Cyrilda's gaze followed his, her heart beginning a slow, heavy drum against her ribs. He was staring at a patch of disturbed earth, a mound of red rocks piled with a strange, deliberate care. At its head, a crude cross, fashioned from 2 weathered pieces of driftwood, was thrust into the ground. It was a grave. The horse she had tracked across miles of desolate wasteland, the last living piece of her father's soul, had led her to a tomb in the middle of nowhere. And as a new terrifying question began to form in her mind, who she saw it. A flicker of movement from the shadows beside the rocks. Something impossible. Something that wasn't a horse. Something that was human. The silence on the ridge stretched thin and taut as a wire. Cyrilda's breath caught in her throat. The flicker of movement was not the wind playing tricks on her sun-dazzled eyes. It was real. From a crude dugout carved into the rock face beside the grave like a wound, a figure emerged. He was a wraith, a man made of dust and regret. His clothes were the tattered remains of something once fine, now hanging from a frame so gaunt it seemed a harsh gust might scatter him. A dark matted beard covered a face pale as bone, and his eyes, the only living things in that skeletal mask, burned with a feverish, haunted light. He moved with the shuffling, uncertain gait of a man who had forgotten the feel of solid ground beneath his feet. Cyrilda's hand tightened on her knife, the worn handle a familiar comfort. Every instinct screamed caution. This was the Devil's Jaw, a place where men vanished. Maybe this was the reason why. The man saw her then, a dark silhouette against the searing sky. He flinched, raising a trembling hand to shield his eyes. A raw, guttural croak escaped his throat. "Stay back!" He rasped the sound like stones grinding together. "He sent you, didn't he?" Finally came to finish the job. His words were a riddle wrapped in venom. Cyrilda remained on the high ground, her voice steady, betraying none of the chaos churning within her. "I don't know who you're talking about." I followed my horse. The man's hollow laugh was a brittle, terrible sound. He looked from her to the stallion, a flicker of something, not madness, but a deep, profound sorrow passing through his gaze. "He's not your horse," he whispered. The words struck Cyrilda with the force of a physical blow, challenging the very bedrock of her quest. Before she could answer, before she could demand an explanation, Ghost acted. The stallion, who had stood like a statue of gray marble, let out a low, soft nicker. He took a deliberate step toward the man, then another, until his great head rested on the man's frail shoulder in a gesture of unmistakable loyalty and love. The man's body sagged, his brittle anger dissolving into a wave of bone-deep weariness. His hand came up to rest on the stallion's neck, his fingers tangling in the dark mane. "Knew you'd come back, old friend," he murmured, his voice cracking. "Knew you wouldn't leave me." The effort was his undoing. His eyes rolled back, the fever claiming him completely. He swayed for a heart-stopping moment, a scarecrow in the wind, before collapsing in a heap onto the red dust right at the foot of the crude wooden cross. Silence returned, heavier and more absolute than before. Cyrilda was alone. Alone with a horse that wasn't hers, a strange silver buckle, and an unconscious man lying on his own grave. She could leave. This was not her fight. Her father's pragmatic voice echoed in her head, a phantom of reason. Don't go borrowing trouble, Siri. The world has enough of its own to spare. She could take the horse he was still a valuable asset and ride away. Forget she saw any of this. It would be the smart thing to do, the safe thing. But her gaze fell on the man's still form on the faithful stallion standing guard over him, and she knew she couldn't. Her father had also taught her that some things were worth more than safety. Her descent into the basin was a choice. With each careful step down the shale-covered slope, she felt like she was leaving a part of her old self behind the grieving daughter, the desperate rancher, and stepping into a story that was wilder and more dangerous than she could have imagined. She knelt beside the man, the heat of the ground seeping through her worn trousers. She gently pushed the filthy hair from his forehead. He was burning with fever. A poorly healed wound seeped through the rags on his side. This was a man who had been clinging to life by a thread. Her eyes moved to the cross. The name carved into the wood was rough but clear. Theron. She looked from the letters etched in wood to the face of the stranger, and the impossible truth crashed over her. He had been left for dead. This grave wasn't a memorial. It was a lie. She uncorked her canteen. The water was precious, perhaps the difference between her own life and death on the ride back, but she didn't hesitate. She wet a strip of cloth torn from her sleeve and gently touched it to his cracked, dry lips. He stirred a low moan escaping his throat, but did not wake. As she worked, a new sound reached her. It was faint, almost lost in the vastness, but it was unmistakable. Not the wind, not the call of a hawk. It was the distant, rhythmic sound of shod horses moving with purpose. Someone else was coming, and a cold certainty settled in her heart. It wasn't help. It was the he Theron had spoken of, the man who finished the job. Here is part 3 of the story. Part 3. The Shadow of the Hunter. The distant sound of shod horses was a death knell in the vast, silent cathedral of the desert. Cyrilda's blood ran cold. The world which had stretched to an infinite horizon suddenly shrank to the size of her own frantic heartbeat. There was no time for questions, no time for the impossible reality of the man at her feet. There was only the hunt, and they were now the prey. His name was Theron. The cross said so. His silence was a dead weight, a burden of flesh and bone she had to carry. "Come on." She grunted, her voice a raw whisper. She hooked her arms under his pulling. He was heavier than he looked, a dead weight of limp muscle and misery. The dugout he'd emerged from was their only chance, a dark, gaping maw in the rock face. Their tomb or their sanctuary. She dragged him her boots, slipping on the loose shale, her muscles screaming in protest. Dust filled her lungs, tasting of panic and iron-rich earth. Every scrape of his body against the ground sounded like a thunderclap in the unnatural quiet. The approaching hoofbeats grew louder, a relentless, rhythmic engine of doom. She finally wrestled him into the cramped earthen hollow. It smelled of damp stone and desperation. Propping him against the cool back wall, she scrambled back out into the searing light. She had seconds. Her eyes scanned the basin, finding a loose slab of sandstone heavy and flat. With a final desperate surge of adrenaline, she heaved it, sliding it over the opening of the dugout until it looked like nothing more than a shadow against the rock. Now the horse. Ghost stood nearby his ears, twitching his intelligent eyes wide with alarm. She couldn't hide him, but she couldn't leave him for them to find. She walked to him, grabbed his mane, and looked him square in the eye. "Go!" She hissed, her voice low and urgent. "Get out of here! Vanish!" She gave his flank a hard slap. For a moment the stallion only blinked at her. Then, as if understanding the silent, desperate plea, he turned and bolted, his powerful form melting into the labyrinth of rocks and canyons, his hoofbeats a fading echo. Cyrilda dove into a narrow crevice between 2 towering boulders, pressing herself flat, her heart hammering against the stone. She held her breath and waited. They arrived. 3 riders, their forms hard and sharp against the bright sky. 2 were rough-looking men, hired guns with cruel, thoughtless faces. But the man in the lead was different. He was dressed in a fine dark coat incongruous in this desolate place. He dismounted with an air of cold ownership, his gaze sweeping over the grave with a smug, reptilian satisfaction. "Still here. Good," the man in the coat said, his voice smooth and cultured. "The buzzards haven't scattered the stones." One of his men spat a wad of tobacco near the cross. "You sure he's dead, boss? We left him in a bad way, but that Theron, he was tough." The leader, the boss, chuckled without humor. "No one survives a collapsed shaft and a week without water. This cross is his only legacy now. The claim is mine. The gold is mine. Corbin." The name seemed to materialize in Cyrilda's mind, a perfect fit for the cold ambition in the man's eyes. He had just confessed to murder as casually as if he were remarking on the weather. The second gunman, however, was scanning the ground, his eyes narrowed. "Boss," he said slowly, "horse tracks, fresh ones, and they ain't ours." Corbin's smug expression vanished, replaced instantly by a mask of ice-cold fury. "What?" He strode over his polished boots, leaving sharp prints in the dust. He saw the tracks leading away. He saw the faint drag marks Cyrilda had left. His eyes, like a hawk's, scanned every rock, every shadow. "He had help," Corbin snarled, the smoothness gone from his voice, replaced by a dangerous, ragged edge. "Or he's not as dead as I thought. Find him. Find whoever was here, now." The hunt began. The 2 gunmen spread out their pistols drawn, kicking at rocks, peering into crevices. Cyrilda flattened herself further into the shadows, making herself small, willing the stone to swallow her whole. The world was nothing but the sound of her own blood roaring in her ears and the crunch of boots on gravel getting closer. Closer. One of the men stopped. He was so close she could smell the stale sweat and cheap whiskey on him. His shadow fell over her hiding place, a long, dark stain that blotted out the sun. He paused, his head cocked, listening. Cyrilda held her breath until her lungs burned. He was looking right at her. Time became a frozen thing, a single held breath. The gunman's shadow was a shroud, stealing the light, the air, the very hope from Cyrilda's hiding place. She saw the cruel curiosity in his eyes as he leaned closer, his gaze sweeping the rock face. He was a predator, sniffing the wind, sensing that the scent of fear was too fresh, too sharp. Cyrilda was a creature of stone and shadow. Her hand fused to the hilt of her knife, praying the world would forget she existed. His hand started to rise, his pistol glinting. Then, from the far side of the basin, a sound ripped through the tension, a sharp, piercing whinny followed by the distinct clatter of dislodged rocks. Ghost. The gunman's head snapped up, his attention instantly diverted. "Boss?" he yelled, turning away from the crevice. Over there, sounded like the horse. Corbin strode back into view, his face a mask of impatience. He listened for a moment, then made a swift, cold calculation. He can't have gotten far on foot. A man in his condition would be crawling. The horse will lead us straight to him, or to whoever helped him. We're wasting time here. Let's ride. They mounted, their movements economical and ruthless. The 3 riders spurred their horses, disappearing over the ridge, their dark forms swallowed by the shimmering heat. Their hunt had a new direction. Cyrilda did not move. She waited until the last echo of their hoofbeats had been absorbed by the vast, indifferent silence. Only then did she allow herself to breathe the air flooding her lungs in a shuddering, ragged gasp. Her body trembled, the adrenaline receding, leaving behind a cold, sharp clarity. They were safe for now. But the basin was no longer a sanctuary. It was a crime scene. And Corbin would be back. She scrambled to the dugout, her hands raw as she pulled the heavy stone slab away from the entrance. The darkness within was absolute. "Theron," she whispered, her voice swallowed by the gloom. A low moan answered her. She slipped inside her eyes, struggling to adjust. He was where she had left him, propped against the wall, but his head was up. In the slivers of light from the entrance, she could see his eyes were open, unfocused, but aware. They fixed on her. An angel. He breathed, his voice a dry, feverish rasp. Or another ghost. Cyrilda knelt, pushing aside the fear and exhaustion, letting a brusque practicality take over. It was a shield against the madness of the situation. "Neither. I'm the woman who just kept you from getting killed." She held her canteen to his lips. He drank the water, spilling down his chin, his throat working greedily. The small act of mercy seemed to pull him further back from the brink. His eyes cleared, a flicker of sharp intelligence cutting through the fever's haze. "Corbin," he stated. It was not a question. He was here. Cyrilda confirmed, her voice low. "He came to admire his handiwork." She gestured vaguely toward the grave outside. "He thinks you're dead. Now he's hunting your horse, thinking it will lead him to me." "He won't stop," Theron whispered, a new urgency in his voice. He tried to push himself up, but his body betrayed him, a wave of pain and weakness crashing over him. He slumped back, his head hitting the earthen wall with a dull thud. "Stay still," Cyrilda commanded, her hands moving to inspect the makeshift bandage on his side. It was soaked through with a foul-smelling fluid. When she peeled it back, she had to stifle a gasp. The wound was not just a wound. It was a festering pit, the flesh around it angry and red-streaked with dark lines that snaked away from the injury. The fever wasn't just from exposure. It was poison spreading through his blood. Her father's words came back to her, then a lesson from a long-ago winter when a ranch hand had taken a rusty nail to the leg. The wound is the door, Siri. It's the fever that comes through it that kills a man. A new, more immediate terror seized her. They had escaped Corbin's guns for now, but a slower, more patient killer was already inside these stone walls with them. Theron watched her face, reading the grim truth in her eyes. "It's bad," he said, his voice flat, with a resignation that chilled her to the bone. Cyrilda met his gaze, her own resolve hardening into something sharp and absolute. She had not dragged this man from the jaws of one hell just to watch him slide into another. "We have to move," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "We have to move now." "Can't?" He rasped, his eyes fluttering closed. "No strength?" "You'll find it," she countered, grabbing his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "Because if we stay here, Corbin will come back and put a bullet in you. But if we don't get you help, the fever will do his job for him first. Either way, this dugout becomes your tomb. I, for one, refuse to let that happen." The journey out of the basin was a descent into a new kind of hell. Theron was a cross she had chosen to bear, a dead weight of fevered flesh and broken will. He leaned on her, his arms slung over her shoulder, his ragged breaths hot against her neck. Every step was a battle against gravity, against the sharp, unforgiving rocks that tore at her boots and his. The sun was a malevolent eye, watching their slow, agonizing progress. Theron drifted between the fevered shores of delirium and fleeting, painful moments of lucidity. In the haze, the world was a blur of pain and shimmering sky, but there was one constant, her. He could feel the solid, unyielding strength in her small frame. He could smell the scent of dust and sage that clung to her clothes. He could hear her voice, a low, steady murmur that was not gentle, but was infinitely grounding. Just a little further, she'd grunt, her voice tight with exertion. "Keep your feet under you." During one of his clear moments, as they rested in the scant shade of a towering boulder, his gaze focused on her profile. Her face was smudged with dirt and sweat. Her lips were cracked, but her eyes were fixed on the horizon with a searing intensity. Why, he managed to rasp the word, scraping his raw throat. "Why are you doing this?" Cyrilda didn't look at him. She was rewrapping the crude bandage on his side, her movements efficient and impersonal. "Because your horse wouldn't leave you," she said, her voice flat. "Seems wrong to prove him a fool." She paused, her hand stilling for a fraction of a second. "And because no one deserves to be buried before they're dead." The simple, stark honesty of it silenced him. He drifted away again, this time into a darker memory. The groan of failing timbers, the smell of damp earth and blasting powder, and Corbin's face illuminated by a single lantern looking down at him in the shaft. There was no anger in his partner's eyes, no malice, just the cold, detached appraisal one gives a piece of machinery that has outlived its usefulness. "It's just business," Theron Corbin had said, his voice echoing in the darkness just before he kicked the lantern over, plunging the world into a crushing final blackness. He awoke with a gasp, the phantom weight of the mountain on his chest. Cyrilda was holding the canteen to his lips again. "I'm Cyrilda," she said, her voice cutting through the fog of his memory. It was not an introduction. It was a statement of fact. Theron, he breathed the name, feeling foreign on his own tongue. For the first time, he was not just a ghost she had found. He had a name. She had a name. They were two people bound together in this desolate wasteland. They pressed on. The world dissolved into a rhythm of pain and endurance. Cyrilda's strength was beginning to fray the edges of her resolve, worn thin by the sun and the sheer deadening weight of him. He stumbled more frequently, his apologies lost in feverish mumbles. Just when she thought her legs would buckle, just when the first tendrils of true despair began to curl in her gut, she saw it. Far ahead, a single spire of red rock rose from the earth, twisted into the shape of a crooked finger pointing at the sky. Her father's landmark. If you're ever truly lost, Siri, he'd told her on a ride years ago, find the finger. There's life there. The earth gives a gift if you know where to look. A surge of new strength, born of desperate hope, flooded her veins. "We're close," she told Theron, her voice cracking, with an emotion she refused to name. "We're almost there." It took another hour, an eternity of grit and whispered encouragement. They stumbled into a narrow hidden canyon, and the air instantly changed. It was cooler, smelling of damp stone and green living things. And then they saw it. It wasn't a grand oasis, but a small, sacred miracle. A spring trickled from a fissure in the rock, spilling into a clear, deep pool. Around its edges grew a lush carpet of broad-leafed plants, their leaves a vibrant, impossible green. The healing herbs her father had told her about. "We made it." Cyrilda breathed, her knees finally giving way. She helped Theron to the water's edge, where he drank like a man who had forgotten the very taste of it. His relief was short-lived as a violent shiver racked his body, the fever tightening its grip. As she began to gather the cool, waxy leaves of the herbs, a shadow fell over them. She looked up, her body tensing, her hand flying to her knife. But it was not Corbin. Ghost, the stallion, stepped silently from the rocks. He was not a phantom of the wilderness, but a quiet, powerful guardian. He walked to the pool, drank his fill, then stood a few feet away watching them, his presence a calm, steady reassurance. He had led her here, and he had waited. Cyrilda looked from the loyal horse to the shivering man at her feet. She had brought him to water. She had found him a sanctuary. But looking at the dark poison streaking from his wound, at the deadly fire burning in his eyes, she knew the journey was far from over. She now had to fight the battle the fever was waging for his soul. She waged a quiet war in the heart of the canyon, a battle fought with cool water and crushed leaves. The sanctuary, with its impossible gift of life, became her apothecary. The world shrank to the size of Theron's wound and the raging fire of his fever. She worked with a grim, focused desperation. She crushed the waxy green herbs between two stones, the scent sharp and earthy, and mixed them with spring water to make a dark, soothing poultice. Cleaning the wound was an act of brutal intimacy. She had to cut away the ragged dying flesh, her father's knife feeling alien in her hand when used for such a delicate, terrible purpose. Theron thrashed in his delirium, a low, guttural moan tearing from his throat, but she held him fast, her voice a low, steady command. "Be still. Be still now. I've got you." He was adrift on a sea of fever, and her voice was the only lighthouse. He did not hear the words, but he felt their anchor. In his fractured dreams she was a shifting presence. Sometimes a hawk-faced angel, her features stern and unforgiving. Sometimes a ghost herself, her hands cool as river stones against his burning skin. He spoke in these moments, his voice a tattered whisper weaving a tale she pieced together from fragments. The claim. All of it, he said. Smell of blasting powder. Timbers cracking like old bones. "Corbin, your face, you bastard. Just business." Corbin. The name she had given the man in the fine coat. The name Theron now spoke with a venom that cut through the fever's haze. She listened to the broken pieces of his story, and the image of the smug, cold man at the graveside sharpened into that of a monster. Her fight was no longer just instinct. It was justice. For 2 days and 2 nights she fought the poison. She kept the poultice, fresh forced water, and a thin broth of boiled roots between his lips, and used cloths soaked in the frigid spring water to battle the relentless heat that consumed him. Ghost. The stallion never strayed far, a silent gray guardian, watching from the edge of the firelight. On the morning of the 3rd day, the air in the canyon felt different. The oppressive heat of the fever had finally broken. Theron woke to a world that was blessedly still and sharp. The pain was a dull, distant ache, no longer a roaring fire. He felt weak, hollowed out, but he felt alive. He turned his head. She was there. Asleep in a sitting position against the rock wall, her head slumped forward, the empty canteen resting in her lap. Her face in repose had lost its hard, defiant edge, revealing the profound exhaustion beneath. He saw the dark smudges under her eyes, the lines of strain around her mouth. She had not slept. She had not rested. She had waged his war for him. He shifted, and the small movement was enough. Her eyes snapped open instantly, alert the warrior returning in a flash. "How do you feel?" she asked, her voice raspy with fatigue. There was no sentiment in it, only a clinical assessment. "Like I've been kicked to death by a mule," he rasped back, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. He looked at his side. The wound was clean, the angry redness subsided. "You stayed." "I told you I would," she said simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. He held her gaze, and for the first time she saw not a wraith or a victim, but the man he was or had been. His eyes were clear, and they held a gratitude so immense it needed no words. Later, as he sipped the broth she gave him, he told her everything. The real story. They were partners, he and Corbin. Old friends from the war who had come west chasing a dream. They had found it, too. A vein of gold so rich it was the stuff of legend. The mother lode. It changes a man, a find like that. Theron said, his voice low and heavy with memory. It found a rot in Corbin I never knew was there. He wanted it all. He said we needed one last blast to open the main chamber. He stared into the fire, his eyes seeing a different darkness. It wasn't to open the vein. It was to close the shaft, with me in it. The pieces clicked into place for Cyrilda. The grave, the stolen claim, the man who had everything to lose if Theron ever clawed his way back to the world of the living. The horse, she said quietly. Ghost. He was tethered at the camp. Theron nodded. Must have broken free in the chaos. He's all I had left. A painful silence settled between them, the full weight of the betrayal hanging in the air. This company Corbin built with my gold Theron finally set his voice hard as iron. He had a name for it. He was always so proud of his cleverness. What name? Cyrilda asked, a strange, cold premonition stirring within her. Theron looked at her, his eyes dark with the memory of his stolen future. Blackwood Mining. The name hit Cyrilda like a physical blow. Blackwood Mining, the same name on the threatening letters tucked away in her father's desk. The company that was trying to force her out to buy her land to steal the water rights to the very creek that fed her ranch. Her enemy was his enemy. Her future and his past were on a collision course, and Corbin was the architect of both their ruins. She looked from the exhausted man brought back from the dead to the wide, unforgiving expanse beyond their sanctuary. Her fight was no longer just for a piece of land. She met Theron's gaze, her own expression hardening, her voice low and steady. "He didn't just bury you, Theron. He's trying to bury my father's legacy right alongside you." A grim, dangerous smile touched her lips. "Well, it seems to me that two ghosts are harder to keep down than one." They returned from the wilderness not as survivors, but as hunters. Their stage was the town bank on the very day Corbin, in his fine coat and smug confidence, arrived to sign the final papers that would steal Cyrilda's land. He sat at the polished desk, the banker and a once loyal sheriff at his side, a king in his stolen castle. The door swung open. A hush fell over the room as Cyrilda and Theron stepped inside. He was no longer a wraith. Strength had settled back into his shoulders, and his eyes burned with a cold, clear fire. Corbin's smile froze, then shattered. He was seeing a ghost walk in the daylight. Corbin Theron's voice was low and steady, carrying the weight of the grave he'd escaped. "I hear you're acquiring some land. Does the deed mention the collapsed mine shaft it's built on? Does it mention my name?" Before Corbin could sputter a denial, Theron tossed the leather-bound ledger onto the desk. It landed with a sound as final as a gavel. "My name is on that claim. My sweat is in its gold. And my blood is on your hands." Cornered and exposed, the thin veneer of the businessman burned away, revealing the beast beneath. With a roar of fury, Corbin lunged not for the door, but for Cyrilda. He grabbed her, pulling her back against him as a shield, the cold muzzle of a hidden pistol pressed to her temple. But he made a fatal miscalculation. He thought he had captured a frightened ranch girl. He was holding fire. Cyrilda didn't scream. She didn't struggle. She acted. With all her force, she drove the heel of her worn boot down onto Corbin's instep. A sharp crack of bone echoed in the silent room, followed by his howl of pained shock. His grip loosened for a single crucial second. It was all Theron needed. He moved like a thunderclap, disarming Corbin with a brutal efficiency learned in the darkest corners of survival. The fight was over before it truly began. Weeks later, the autumn sun cast long, golden shadows across the valley. The Blackwood Mining sign had been torn down, and Theron's name was cleared. He stood with Cyrilda on the porch of her ranch, their ranch. The air was clean, the silence no longer filled with grief, but with a quiet, hard-won peace. Nearby, the Stallion ghost grazed peacefully. He was the one who had started the journey, a loyal heart leading the way through despair. He had sought out his master, but in doing so had brought them both home.